Let's look at an absolutely amazing, terrifying and obscure weapon, the Bichuwa Bagh Nakh. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and this is part of my Obscure Weapons series. There's a playlist, check it out if you haven't done already. Now this amazing weapon, it isn't mine, it's actually borrowed from a friend of mine, Gavin Locke, so thank you to Gavin for that. This is the Bagh Nakh, but it's not just a Bagh Nakh, it's a Bichuwa Bagh Nakh. What do all those words mean? Well, it's an Indian weapon, so those are Hindi words. You've got similar words also in things like Urdu as well. I believe in Urdu it would be Vag Nakya, something like that, so a different version, but basically the same words, different dialect. And the most famous element of this and the most noticeable element of this are these claws. Now, Bagh means tiger, as in Bagheera in the Jungle Book. So Bagh, tiger, Bagh Nakh means tiger claw. And this is probably the most famous element of this, these tiger claws here. This element here, the dagger blade, is called the Bichuwa, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But it's the combination of these two things, the Bagh Nakh and the Bichuwa, which make this an extremely unusual version of this weapon. The more common version is just the claws or the Bichuwa as two separate weapons. So the Bichuwa Bagh Nakh. Now, let's look at a bit at the context and the history of the Bagh Nakh. So first up, these tiger claw weapons, it's believed that they were devised originally in probably the 1500s or 1600s. It's a little bit unknown, a little bit obscure, but this is when they first appear to us in a famous episode of history in the 1600s. If we travel back in time to the 1600s, a lot of India was ruled at this time by the Mughal Empire. In this case, particularly the Bijapur Sultanate. And the ruler was a guy called Afzal Khan. Now, Afzal Khan was a mighty ruler, mighty warrior, but there were rebel cells, if we call them that, in India at the time, in what were known as essentially the nucleus of what became the Marathas. Okay, so there were Maratha rebels. Now, many of you will have heard of the Maratha Empire. This is something which comes later on, but they started out as people who were essentially fighting against Mughal rule. So the Marathas, who were predominantly Hindu, I believe, they had rebels, and they were starting to come into conflict and essentially sort of rise up against Mughal ruling class. In this case, Afzal Khan. So the leader of the Maratha rebels was a guy called Shivaji. Now, there were negotiations that were supposed to take place between Afzal Khan and Shivaji, but Shivaji did not trust Afzal Khan, turns out right to do so, and so therefore he armoured himself. He wore mail, aka chainmail, under his clothes and armoured himself up well. And at the meeting, indeed, Afzal Khan pulled out a katar. What is a katar? A katar is one of these. So this is the kind of most common, sometimes referred to as a punch dagger, probably one of the most common daggers in use at the time in India. Afzal Khan pulled out a katar and tried to stab Shivaji, but Shivaji's armour, his mail armour, stopped the blow. And he in turn pulled out a Bagh Nakh, and according to some sources also a dagger, a Bichuwa, and proceeded to disembowel Afzal Khan and kill him, which was this is obviously a hugely important event in Indian history, and was essentially one of the founding myths of or legends, shall we say, of the Maratha Empire. So for that reason, the Bagh Nakh was a much beloved weapon within the Maratha Empire, and in fact it continued to be later on under the Sikhs as well. So this weapon, this tiger claw weapon, is not just a novelty, it's also something which is deeply tied in with Indian history and the Maratha Empire's kind of founding stories. But you'll notice that some of the stories also mention the use of a Bichuwa. Now, a Bichuwa is a type of dagger. Now, again, these are historical sources. We obviously don't know how correct different sources are. But if Shivaji used a Bagh Nakh and a Bichuwa, then the fact that we've got here a Bichuwa Bagh Nakh combined, it might be that actually he was using one of these, or it might be that later designers, knowing that this famous character had used these two weapons, combined them into one. So the reason that this is so unusual is not just because it is a tiger claw, a Bagh Nakh, but because it is also combined with a Bichuwa. So it's a dagger and its claws. Now let's talk a little bit about its features. So we've got 4 claws, that's pretty traditional, and then we have a ring at top and bottom. We'll get onto the dagger in a second. The claws are attached in a very interesting way. There's many ways of attaching them, but the way that these are attached is via a little pin, like a tang, on each of the claws. I will try and get the camera to focus. You can just see those little circles there. are essentially little tangs that come off these blades. So they go through a hole and then they are brazed. And in addition, they overlap on this edge down here where they are also brazed. So really actually a strong and ingenious way of attaching 4 blades to a flat plate with a ring at top and bottom. Now, how do you hold it? There's actually various different ways you could hold this, and it depends partly on the size of the weapon, the size of the person's hand. Should be pointed out, these holes are probably a little bit small for my fingers. I can't fit it on my right hand. This does seem to be a left-hand version anyway. My left-hand fingers, like many people who are right-hand dominant, are slightly thinner than my right-hand fingers. So this is probably the most widespread and conventional way of holding it. However, there are some suggestions that sometimes you could place the thumb through the top ring. And I actually find this very secure and actually in many ways more comfortable because it places 3 fingers behind those claws, which fit nicely into those 3 grooves between the claws and gives you a lot of leverage. So actually, for me personally, this is a more comfortable way of holding it. I should say there are some sources that state that these claws were sometimes poisoned. Now, clearly these are not big claws, and if you're going to go for a neck or somewhere where you can get to arteries, those claws are going to be big enough. But for the most part, those are not going to go through clothes, they're not going to create particularly deep wounds. So if they were poisoned, that would obviously make them more effective. But in this particular case, you've also got the Bichuwa dagger, sometimes known as a scorpion dagger because of its cool recurved shape. Recurved blades, very common in India. Some parallels perhaps with yataghans found in Turkish areas and Persia. But these types of recurved blades go back hundreds of years in India, and the Bichuwa is quite an ancient type of dagger. So combining the Bichuwa dagger with the Bagh Nakh kind of makes sense, and it's not surprising in a way that they did it. But these are less common than the simple Bagh Nakh or the simple Bichuwa dagger. Now, these continued in use right the way through to the 19th century, and in fact there were even fighting styles associated with these. Kind of wrestlers used them as well. They were also carried quite prominently by the Sikhs, particularly the Nihangs. The Nihangs often carried these as a concealed weapon, and in some cases there's even a suggestion that Nihangs suggested women carry the Bagh Nakh, probably not with the dagger most of the time, just the claws, as self-defense items. And one of the main things about them, of course, is they can be hidden in the hand, so the person can't necessarily see that you're holding a weapon. And this also, of course, goes all the way back to that original story with Shivaji, where he has a concealed weapon, basically. So Afzal Khan didn't realise that he had the Bagh Nakh hidden in his hand. So these were sometimes carried concealed rather than open. And moreover, if I just pick up the standard Indian sword of the day was the talwar, something which is featured a lot on my channel. And if you're using a talwar, what you might not notice sometimes is your opponent has the Bagh Nakh hidden in their other hand. So they might be fighting with the sword, but if they manage to cross your sword, or they might even have a shield on their arm and come in close, they might be able to rake across the neck or across the face with the Bagh Nakh, which you didn't realise was there. So remember, the spare hand, or what might appear to be an empty hand in Indian martial arts, can sometimes be far more dangerous than just a bare hand. Now, as mentioned, these even featured in Indian martial arts, and there's a traveller in 1864 in British India in the state of Baroda, which was a semi-independent princely state rather than directly under British rule. And this traveller actually saw wrestlers competing with these weapons in hand and describes the gruesome results of skin and flesh torn asunder. Quite a gruesome spectacle, but the ruler of Baroda thought it was fantastic entertainment. So these were used in a traditional martial arts form or kind of gladiatorial combat of the day. And moreover, these are still used in traditional martial arts such as Shastra Vidya, for example. Just like all weapons from history, there were more fancy versions. Some of these have Kofgari and gold and silver decorations. Some were even jewelled in such a way so the Bagh Nakh could be concealed in the hand, and these rings here would actually just look like normal dress rings made of gold with gems and things on. But most that you find are made of one piece of steel like this and are not expensive items. They're almost throwaway items. And they have become often associated with murderers and assassins and sneaky ne'er-do-wells. But we should never forget that fundamentally this is also the weapon which is at the very founding of the Maratha Empire. So they did have a sort of noble and heroic use some of the time as well. So here we go. This is the Bagh Nakh, is the tiger claw, combined with the Bichuwa. So the Bichuwa dagger, Bichuwa Bagh Nakh. Another obscure weapon for my series here on Schola Gladiatoria. I hope that's been enjoyable. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them down in the comments. If you've got suggestions for other obscure weapons you'd like to see featured on the channel, then very happy to do so and consider those. Maybe there'll be something that I haven't even heard of myself, because some of these I haven't, as it has to be said. So there we go, the Bagh Nakh, the Bichuwa Bagh Nakh. I hope you've enjoyed seeing that. I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.